You need a way to stay with your prospect throughout the full buyer's journey. You need a way to get the whole decision committee to be spending time with you so you can educate and build trust across the entire team, not just one individual person. I think that is the biggest key to being able to close deals.
Hi, I'm Joshua Feinberg from DCSMI, the Data Center Sales and Marketing Institute. A little while back, we hosted a webinar called 10 Ways for Colocation Data Centers to Find the Right Niches and Avoid Commoditization. Immediately following the end of the webinar, I hosted an informal Q&A question and answer session where I answered a handful of related questions, including how to improve colocation data center lead generation and lead qualification, how to fill and expand data center space, how to sell IT asset disposition, ITAD, to data center decision makers, as well as how to close colocation data center deals when struggling with commoditization. Let's listen in.
So, the first question that I'm going to address is how do we improve lead quality and lead generation for a colocation data center? And what's the most important thing to be thinking about if you're trying to improve lead generation and lead qualification for a colocation data center? It starts with recognizing that your buyers, your most important and second most important buyer personas, have a very different way of researching and comparing colocation and purchasing colocation than they did as recently as 10 years ago. And it's a combination of a couple of different factors. One is we know when a decision maker that is a baby boomer retiring, it is very unlikely that the person who steps in and takes over is another baby boomer. So if anything, if there was any digital resistance at all that had to do with generational issues, those digital resistance generation issues melt away almost immediately when there's a change in leadership and you're now selling to someone that's in Gen X or a millennial, or in some cases even Gen Z. And just as Google validated 15 years ago that the more highly educated a particular buyer is, the more likely it is that they truly understand the difference between paid and organic on a traditional search engine results page. It's the same thing. Again, newer generations tend to favor a more self-driven buyer's journey, self-propelled buyer's journey. They don't necessarily need the golf tournament or the big cabana party to be able to be influenced in how they evaluate colocation options. And in many ways, they're looking at colocation as a technology purchase as opposed to a real estate investment. And of course, there's real estate involved in providing colocation, but even we know the real estate industry, commercial, residential, industrial, mission critical, it is all going through big periods of change because your buyer personas have very, very different preferences. One of the interesting parts is I sometimes get pushback from CEOs of colocation centers that tell me that, like, yeah, our primary buyer is like a CTO of a manufacturing company or financial services company, and they're different. They don't want like webinars. They don't go to review websites. They don't go to podcasts. I'm like, that's really interesting because these exact same CTOs also buy SaaS. And you recognize that like the SaaS companies have been knocking it out of the park with this playbook for 10 years already. You could trace the roots to people like HubSpot and Content Marketing Institute, Joe Polizzi, Marcus Shart, and all these folks. But at the end of the day, the CTOs, the more highly technical your IT buyer is, the more cynical and the more anti-marketing and the more anti-sales stereotypes you're going to be contending with. So at the end of the day, your best shot for generating the right leads from the right people in the right places and at the right time is showing up in the right context. This is why it's so powerful and yet so important for most of your client-facing team to go through this rebrand, to go through this overhaul, this reposition, this pivot, where you look at the job title that's on their LinkedIn profile, or the job title that's in their email signature, or if you're still doing a lot of events, the job title that's on their business card. Is anyone really worried that they're going to not be able to spend time with sales professionals when it comes to being a CTO or CFO or COO? No. They see you as interchangeable commodities because they're not respecting your expertise. When you're able to turn the corner and now show up as a consultant, as an industry expert, as a teacher, as a trusted advisor, as a thought leader, game-changing impact nearly overnight. And it's not quite as simple as doing a find and replace on the email signature and on the LinkedIn profile. You actually do have to be able to provide value. But in many companies, it starts with identifying that there typically are a few people that rise to that level of being seen as industry experts and consultants and trusted advisors. Your challenge is to be able to cross-pollinate that knowledge through onboarding, ongoing training, formal processes, certifications, to be able to have that trickle down to most or all of your team members. And when you do, game changer for your lead generation. Okay, next question. What does it take to fill and expand data center space? What does it take to fill and expand data center space? So as a colocation operator, there's two fundamental playbooks that I see being executed by companies that are small and mid-sized. The large companies do this a little differently. The large operators do this a little differently. So like if you work for QTS or Flexential or TierPoint or Digital Realty or Equinix or NTT or something like that, there's a different way of approaching this. But for small to mid-size, where it's not the Jeff Bezos two pizza rule, but you can still get everyone together at a sales kickoff that doesn't get completely out of hand. Here's how I would approach it. Is to think more like an IT services company, to think more like a technology services company, and less like a real estate company. So if you look at WeWork, if you look at a co-working company, you don't necessarily want to be selling co-working for servers because that sets you up to be a commodity. On the other hand, if you look at a managed service provider that's seen as fractional CTO, outsourced IT for small and medium-sized businesses, that's really the direction you want to go. And so it's a combination of your business model pivot, and it's a combination of the positioning of your team. That's probably the most important way to approach this. At the end of the day, there's how your business is perceived, that's your ideal client profile, and there's how your buyer personas, the individual stakeholders, perceive your company within the company, how you segment and how you prioritize the most important kind of stakeholder that you build relationships with, the second most important kind of stakeholder that you build relationships, and there may even be a third most, a tertiary. There may also, over time, you may discover a negative buyer persona, which is where when you encounter a certain kind of stakeholder in a certain kind of company, it's like the kiss of death to your client relationship or sales process. So that's where exclusions in LinkedIn, exclusions and ads and drop-down lists and everything like that can be really, really helpful to getting you to the right people. But just recognize too that there's really no such thing as a decision maker as a person anymore, unless they're relatively small companies. In most cases, there's now a decision committee. So even if you manage to get all the way to the CTO or CFO or CEO or COO, whoever you're selling to, they're almost certainly going to kick it back to their team. That's where the content, that's where the thought leadership, that's where the events can have an amazing impact, because it's so much lower risk for an entry level, mid-level, senior level individual contributor on a team to forward around your webinar invitation or webinar recording or downloadable ebook or report or something, or podcast or video to other members of their team, as opposed to sticking their neck out on the line and recommending that they buy your colocation. Of course, that'll come later. But if you're able to arrive much earlier on in the journey, in the formative stages where they just know that there's a problem they need to solve, that there's a goal they're trying to achieve, and you're the one that's able to stay with them. Your team are the ones that are able to stay with them throughout the full journey, through as many of those 28 touch points as possible. It is game changing for ensuring that your company stays on the short list. In some cases, especially for single location or small regional kind of co-location operators, where you're selling to relatively small companies, that educational content, those events can have such a massive impact that in some cases the competitive options vanish out of their shortlist and the shortlist collapses down to your firm. In other words, your educational content, your events, you're helping them to see how other companies like theirs have navigated this journey, how other stakeholders in those companies have navigated this journey, can have such an amazing impact that you may, by the time they get to decision stage, have won already. because you've knocked out nearly all of the competitors, because you have been able to spend so much time influencing how they evaluate all of the different options. You'll know this is working well at like an elite world-class level because you get to an initial meeting or you're doing the tour and they are literally quoting your thought leadership because they have now used your research report, they've used your webinars, they've used your methodology as essentially free consulting for their company to evaluate and think through and how they've compared all of the different options that are in front of them. And that's where the impact of this cannot possibly be overstated. It's not just that your website is your hardest working 724, 365 salesperson who never needs a day off, who never gets into scuffles with coworkers, that never needs a recharge, never burns. None of that stuff. It is that in many cases, recognizing when it comes to digital infrastructure, especially co-location, is you like your sales team is likely willing to work a little more of an extended week. So if you'd say your network operations center staff, your system engineers, your techs probably work 35, 40, 45 hours a week. Your sales sales team, your A's and your SDRs, they'll probably kick it up to 55, 60 hours a week, especially end of month, end of quarter. And that still doesn't hold a candle to the 168 hours a week that your prospects and clients may be interested in having these kinds of conversations. So if someone converts on your website at 2 o'clock on a Sunday afternoon on a holiday weekend, and your whole sales team, including your VP of sales, your CRO, chief commercial, whatever it is, no one's working till 9 o'clock on Tuesday morning, was that 36, 40 hours later or something like that? Your webinar recordings, your downloads can do an amazing job of letting that person literally binge their way and accelerate their way through the whole buyer's journey. But that only exists when you make the investments of figuring out what a person like that needs to know throughout the full journey and builds that and promotes it and makes it a seamless process. So when the next time your sales director, sales leader, account executive, SDR is looking down at something like HubSpot and you're like, this person booked a meeting for 10 o'clock on Tuesday morning. This must be a mistake. They've consumed 73 pages of content on our website. They have filled out 8 different forms. It looks like they've watched 4.5 hours of on-demand webinar recordings. Talk about a shooting fish in the barrel kind of scenario with that sales appointment. All of the education and trust building happened on a holiday weekend because you knew exactly what CTO Tom needed to see in all 28 of those steps. And you made it accessible for CTO Tom to do on his own. And guess what? CTO Tom went from being a complete stranger to the warmest sales opportunity that you're going to have this quarter because you've thought through how to show up in the new journey.
The Data Center Go-to-Market podcast is sponsored by DCSMI, elevating the role of sales, marketing, and go-to-market GTM professionals in the growth of the data center industry. To stay informed about upcoming episodes, make sure that you subscribe to the Data Center Sales and Marketing newsletter on the DCSMI website that can be found at www.dcsmi.com. Again, that URL is www.dcsmi.com.
As a sales professional that is new to ITAD, IT asset and disposition, asset disposition in data centers, ITAD and data centers, I find that many of my peers have been in the industry for over 10 years. What's the best way to start prospecting and building connections with decision makers having no experience to speak of? That is a fantastic question. What do you do if you're brand new to sales and IT asset disposition? And competing against account executives and sales professionals, business development reps that have been in this industry for 10 years, how do you prospect and build connections with decision makers having no experience to speak of? This is a great question, a great scenario that anyone should be able to dive into. The first thing is think of yourself more as a tour guide or a hotel concierge rather than the be-all end-all expert on ITAD. But what I'd encourage you to do, and I don't know whether your employer required this before you joined on or not, is to literally go to a search, whether you're doing this on Copilot or Google or Perplexity, it doesn't matter, but go and invest a couple of hours and literally read every article, watch every video, attend every on-demand podcast that you can, spending a couple of hours on what is IT asset and disposition and how is IT asset and disposition utilized in the data center industry. We actually even have some content on that on DCSMI on the 22 data center technologies that go-to-market professionals need to know about in the space, because that's the beginning of starting to build up some expertise. The next thing I would look to do is I would go to your marketing leader or sales leader and says, where are the buyer personas? Where's the customer insight research? Where are the most recent surveys? Where are the case studies? Where are the testimonials? Where are the reviews? And spend an hour or two reading through those as well to understand in your best client's own words, what are their biggest goals? What are their biggest challenges? What are their biggest frustrations? What causes them to want to go look for something that leads to a IT aspect disposition sales opportunity? In their own words is the most important part. In addition to that, you can look at reviews and case studies for other companies that also provide ITAD. Go to their website, read their case studies page, read their reviews. Go to the YouTube channel and see if there's any interviews or podcasts with their customers. So you start to ingest this and you start to understand what is the conversation that's going on in someone's head, whether it's a CTO, whether it's a help desk person, whether it's a CFO, whether it's a facilities person. Again, this is going to vary depending on the size of data centers that you're selling to. Generally, the smaller the data center operator, the more likely it is that you'll find someone who does 10 different jobs. The larger the data center, you're going to find much more specialization across a lot of different teams. But you'll start to get a sense for their own words on what caused them to prioritize these kinds of initiatives. That's part of your onboarding and your education. A half a day to a day, you can knock it out of the park. The next thing I would strongly consider doing is, as you start coming across this great content, start sharing some of the best resources that you find on LinkedIn, adding a little bit of your own commentary. And obviously, before you do that, make sure your LinkedIn profile is in good shape on all the best practices that people have been optimizing around for at least 10 years. You know, a professional headshot, a value-focused headline, a value-focused summary. Certainly, you want to make sure that you hit the credibility milestone of 500 plus connections. If you have recommendations from past coworkers, past clients, that's even more impactful. If you can pin content up at the top that's of you either guest blogging or appearing on podcasts or at conferences, photos, what have you, that help to show some social proof of something that's tangentially related to what you do. The whole purpose with all of this, though, is to be seen more as a consultant on IT asset disposition and less as a salesperson. So you want to be seen as a resource person, even if initially you're just sharing other people's resources, which ideally are your own company's resources, or at least vendor neutral kind of resources that aren't from a competitor or direct competitor. So those are the kinds of things that I would do on a more intermediate term basis, on things that will take a couple of months to stand up and to start to see, or at least a couple of weeks to stand up to start to see results from. As I would talk to your internal marketing person or your boss, depending on who it is, and say, I have this weird idea that I could position our company and position myself as someone that shares really helpful advice for our most important persona, which may be like a CTO, talking about things that are directly related to asset disposition and the kind of struggles that people go through when they're trying to figure out what to do with massive amounts of high value hardware, server, networking, telecommunication equipment that's being decommissioned. And maybe you bring on decommissioning experts as well, if that's not something that your company is actively involved in. But you build this interview-based podcast. You can see a great example of how DCSMI, how I'm actually doing this with the Data Center Go-to-Market podcast. And you start with your warmest relationships. Interview your internal subject matter experts, interview your favorite clients, interview your favorite channel partners, your favorite MSPs that you work with, whoever it is. And then gradually, as you build up your first 10 or 20 interviews, it becomes easier to go to other people for these kinds of interviews. But that alone will make an enormous difference of boosting your reputation in the space. Okay, what is the key to closing deals for a colocation data center that's struggling with commoditization, that's struggling with finding the right segments? What's the key to closing more deals? Well, the first thing to recognize is that colocation, because just like your company that has multi-year engagements, multi-year agreements, a lot of the prospects and clients that you're talking to may also be bound by multi-year contracts, multi-year engagements that they're trying to get out of. So unless you have the resources, the capital to literally be able to partially or fully buy them out, that's just a longer sales cycle. But assuming that you have a pipeline of deals where they're coming to the last 3 to 6 months, 6 to 9 months of their colocation with another colocation provider, then the key to closing deals is everything that we have talked about earlier today. It's showing up not as a salesperson that's trying to close a deal or someone focused on quota, commission, getting it to closed won WON status. It's focused on solving a business problem and solving a technology problem for your clients. And what this comes down to is you need to invest a fair amount of time getting educated about the biggest business challenges and technology challenges that most of your clients and prospects have that cause them to become colocation clients in the first place. This is, again, your basic 101 basic buyer persona 101 research. And from there, you're building out these great educational resources so they can self-educate and carry them through the buyer's journey. You're putting together these amazing educational event experiences where they're going to get to know your client-facing team as humans, and they'll build up the know, like, and trust, where you can educate and build trust with those prospects and clients at scale. And those events experiences and those premium content resources can do wonders to get your expertise circulating among the full decision committee in those companies. And that's usually the key to making a lot of this work, is truly understanding all of the different stakeholders that are involved in their decision about colocation, which in many cases is going to be a multi-year time commitment. It's understanding who the different stakeholders are and having content and events and resources that are especially helpful for each of those different kinds of people. So there is spending a huge amount of those 28 touch points with members of your team. What I see a lot of colocation operators doing that causes me to kind of shake my head and wonder if if they've taken the Back to the Future DeLorean and are selling to people living in a different time and place, is I still see colocation operators spending a huge percentage of their marketing and sales budget on an annual basis on big conferences. And there's nothing inherently wrong with sponsoring a major golf tournament or having a great cabana party. However, each of those touch points, each of those events only counts as one of the 28 touch points. That means that if you spend 80% of your annual budget on these two events, you need to somehow figure out a way to get into as many of those other 26 touch points as possible over the next several weeks or next several months. Otherwise, there's a really good chance that you're going to lose that prospect or client to a competitor who's showing up where you're not. Let that sink in for a moment. A really good analogy for those of you that are big sports fans, and it doesn't matter whether you're a football fan, or soccer fan, or a basketball fan, or a baseball fan. Think of yourself as a general manager of a sports team, and the owner of the professional sports team gives you a certain budget. And sure, everyone would love to have the superstar. But the problem is with signing the superstar to your team, that one player, that one professional athlete may be consuming more than 50% of your budget. So I'm a big baseball fan. I'll use that as the analogy. So on a typical Major League Baseball roster, it used to be 25. Now there's 26 players. So if 50% of your payroll goes to one particular athlete, you have to spread the other 50% of that payroll among 25 other people. And depending on they made a movie about this 20 years ago called Moneyball, based on a book by Michael Lewis. If you've never seen it, it's a really great movie, especially if you like to use sports analogies to explain how you approach data center, go-to-market, digital infrastructure, go-to-market. But at the end of the day, when it comes to your investments in field marketing and conferences and events and talents, you need to think through all of the gaps that you have to fill. And you need to make sure that you're able to spread it around. It's kind of similar to like what an investment manager would do with diversifying a portfolio or something like that. But in this particular case, if you're spending a huge amount of your growth budget on one or two huge events, make sure that you have enough to still do everything that we've talked about today, doing the customer insight research, having great downloadable premium content, podcasts, live streams, webinars, breakfast seminars, lunch and learns. You need a way to stay with your prospects throughout the full buyer's journey. You need a way to get the whole decision committee to be spending time with you so you can educate and build trust across the entire team, not just one individual person. I think that is the biggest key to being able to close deals.
The Data Center Go-to-Market podcast is sponsored by DCSMI, elevating the role of sales, marketing, and go-to-market GTM professionals in the growth of the data center industry. To stay informed about upcoming episodes, make sure that you subscribe to the Data Center Sales and Marketing newsletter on the DCSMI website that can be found at www.dcsmi.com. Again, that URL is www.dcsmi.com.